Hi, everyone. So today, as Dorina was saying, I wanted to talk a little bit about socially assistive robots and how we can use them in healthcare, and particularly to support older adults with activities of daily living, as well as to provide cognitive interventions. The key here of our research is that we're looking at, how to really integrate robots into society and to help people with their everyday life. So mainly what we're looking at is this group of robots that are called assistive robots. And assistive robots is a robot that can help a person, whether it may be in a dangerous situation or task, or in a home environment or office environment. And they range from anything that you see mobile robots helping find victims in disaster environments, for example, after a large earthquake, to therapy robots used with children and older adults to provide cognitive as well as social interventions. The main focus of our research is looking at how to design these robots to help with aging and as well as cognitive impairments as we age. So looking at, could we use socially assistive robots to help with dementia sufferers, to promote independence and aging in place? And what are robots? These pictures kind of show you a few of the robots that we've been developing throughout the years. And really what we're looking at is robots that have human-like features such as faces, arms, they can speak, they have facial expressions, they can move around in their environment, and they still look robotic. However, with these capabilities, they're able to interact naturally with people to help them with activities of daily living and to promote this independence. So there's a number of different tasks we've been looking at over probably now 15 years or so that robots could assist with. And we've looked at particular tasks in the home that seniors would need assistance with, anything from meal preparation where the robot can prompt a person through the steps of making a meal, whether it's breakfast, lunch, or dinner, providing help with clothes to wear, recommending what type of clothes to wear based on weather, the activity that they will be performing that day, promoting exercise through exercise training activities, so the robot can be a facilitator of exercise activities. So upper body, for example, was one area that we were looking at. And a good thing about robots is that they can provide reminders, and they can do that, continuously throughout the day. So this could be medication reminders, self-care, appointments, as well as reminders for social networking, such as using video chats with family or friends and even healthcare professionals. We've also looked at recreational activities to promote that intervention that I was mentioning before. So we've looked at individual activities such as playing card games, one-on-one card games, to group activities such as people playing bingo or trivia and the robot facilitating these activities. And a lot of this work has been done in long-term care and retirement homes. So this is our first robot that we ever developed, Brian. I'm just going to play a quick video just to show you what Brian looks like. And then I'll talk about a few of the studies we've conducted with Brian. So you can see, as I was mentioning before, you can hear a little bit Brian's voice. But you can see that Brian has that human-like features that I was mentioning. It has facial expression, so it can smile, it can become sad, and it waves, similar to how we do as people. And then it has this clear voice in order for it to display or communicate with people, its intent. So the first activity that we looked at using Brian was that memory game scenario that I was talking about with cards. And this is really just a picture game where the idea is that cards are flipped over upside down, and two cards are flipped at once, and the main objective is to match the pictures on the cards. And we use very simple objects on the cards, such as a frog, a telephone, a diamond ring. And we wanted the robot to promote interaction in this game. Could we have individuals playing the game with Brian? So we set up the robot to be able to detect these cards. So there's specific card features that it was looking at, and they're unique to each of the objects on the cards so that Brian would know which cards are being flipped over. We just used a simple webcam on a table to show for the robot to be able to detect these cards. And the objective was to see how long people would interact in this game with the Brian robot. And the robot's real aim was to engage them and support them in the activity. So once we designed the robot, we took it to a long-term care facility, and what we did was we just left it for 2 days on the first floor of a large communication hub in the center. And what we wanted to do is, while people were coming to get their coffee or they were coming down, the robot would see people walk by and ask them if they wanted to play the memory card game with them. We wanted to see how many people would stop and interact with the robot and how they would interact with the robot. So during the course of the 2 days, we had 40 older adults interact with the robot. And since we had it open to everybody, we had older adults with normal cognitive controls up to mild Alzheimer's disease come and interact with the robot. There was also a questionnaire they could fill out at the end of the interaction, and we had 22 of them complete that questionnaire as well. And what we really wanted to see is, with the robot, could the robot actually engage the person in this simple card game? Would they listen to the robot? Would they comply with what the robot is asking them? So specifically, the robot would ask them, you know, would you like to join me in the memory game? And then would provide hints of which cards to flip over in order to get a match. And then, of course, we wanted to see how long they would interact with the robot. So we found that the average time varied between 5 to 26 minutes, with an average of 13 minutes. And participants were mostly engaged in the interactions. We had 33 participants that were engaged all the time in the interaction. And what we measured engagement was, would they look at the robot? Were they looking at the cards themselves? And then some of the time is if they looked away during that interaction. And then the same thing with compliance. So when the robot would suggest that they flip over a card, would they flip it over? If they got a match and the robot asked them to remove the cards from the game, would they do so? And we got high numbers for that as well, for all of the time and some of the time. We had one participant who had a hearing aid, and since we had the robot in this large communication hub, there was a lot of background noise. So we were using loudspeakers for people to be able to hear the robot as well. And unfortunately, that was interfering with his hearing aid. But he sat there for about 10 minutes trying to interact with the robot, but unfortunately, he couldn't hear the robot, and because of the interference, he couldn't stay. And so he was the one person that we weren't able to get compliance from. But it really taught us, because this was the first time we were taking a robot into a long-term care facility, so people had never seen a robot, or let alone this type of robot, and we wanted to see how would they just, you know, accept the robot, interact with the robot, what they thought about the robot. And that's what the questionnaire really helped us with. So we wanted to measure things like their attitude towards the robot. Would they ever use the robot again? Was it easy to use? Would they trust the robot? And just looking at, so we used a Likert scale from 1 to 5, 5 being they strongly agreed with these statements. We found that their attitude towards, or their mean attitude or average attitude was pretty good, 4.53 out of 5 for the first time they've interacted with a robot. And same with their intent to use and the ease of use of the robot. And then we looked at things like trust, and their response to trust was pretty neutral. And we looked at this and we thought, well, this makes sense. It was the first time they ever saw a robot, let alone our Brian robot, and the first time they're interacting with this technology as well. I mean, some people don't necessarily even trust people the first time they interact. Trust is something that you gain over time through interaction. So it'll be really interesting to see how this number changes as they continue to interact with the robot. And also what we noticed was that when we left the robot there for 2 days, we had a number of participants come back to interact with the robot. So it wasn't a one-time interaction, which is great for us, because if we're trying to promote cognitive interventions, it's showing us that we could have repeated interactions with the same robot. And our aim was anywhere, you know, between 15 to 20 minutes if we could get interaction. So this taught us a lot in terms of designing these types of robots. And then we wanted to look at other activities that Brian could help with. And before we chose our next activity, what we did was we just went to a few different long-term care facilities, and especially during meal times, and looked at what was happening. Where could we see a robot helping others or assisting the care staff with? And we noticed that meal eating was an interesting activity. You know, it's usually during a 1 hour span. The residents are brought into the dining hall, and all of them have different capabilities. Some can eat on their own, some need prompting to eat, and then some need to be helped physically to eat. And we decided we wanted to target that middle group, the group that may get distracted and not eat, but they could still eat on their own. And we designed Brian to provide meal assistance and through social interactions. And the idea was that it could provide prompting and encouragement during the meal eating activity. And it would also tell jokes, because we think that the social aspects of meal times are very important as well. And then we set out to test Brian. So what we wanted to do was measure a few different things. We developed this meal tray where we could measure how much food was being taken off. We had a main plate, a side plate, and a beverage. And we used just regular utensils. All we did was we put some LEDs at the top of the utensil so we could measure their location, so whether it was at the plate or at the person's mouth. And we did this using off-the-shelf sensors such as Wii remotes. And then we used a Kinect sensor to measure engagement. So if they got distracted, or were they looking at the robot, were they looking at their meal? And then we took the robot and used it with, we had 8 participants, and what we did was we invited them to come have, on 2 occasions, a lunchtime meal with the robot. And we just wanted to see how they interacted with the robot. So I'll show a quick video just to give you what the robot looks like during the interaction, and then I'll show you the interaction with the older adults. So this is Brian again.
Hi, Brian. You look very nice today. Please join me for lunch.
So you can see the robot is waving, giving the menu, talking to the person. And you know, we wanted to, as I mentioned, promote the social interactions. So the robot, you know, compliments the person or the day, the weather, before encouraging them to eat the food. And then it recognizes that they've taken food with a spoon and prompts them to eat their food. It can tell jokes, as I mentioned, also to promote social interactions. And it can laugh. And so it will prompt until the person is done eating. And so just showing you now, you won't see the robot in this video, but you'll see the people interacting with the robot. And so here is the robot just saying what the menu item is and asking the person to enjoy their lunch meal with the robot. Here's just a version of it that the robot is prompting the person to eat. And so you can see that the participant is picking up food and eating it. The robot, as I mentioned, promotes those social interactions. If you haven't taken a sip of your beverage either, the robot can also prompt you to do that, as it's measuring both what's in the plates as well as in the cup. And then when you're done, the robot will mention that the meal is done and say goodbye to the user. And if this was the first interaction, the robot will say that we'll meet again on a different occasion to have one more meal together. So then we wanted to measure a few different things. Again, we wanted to look at engagement and compliance. So what we were looking at was how long did each individual interact with the robot? What were they looking at? Were they looking towards the robot, the meal? How much time did they spend eating the meal? And did they say anything to the robot during the interaction? So you can see from the table that the time varies. So we have some participants that, 8 and 10 minutes, but other participants that needed longer time to eat, almost up to an hour. And so you can see that the robot can provide assistance regardless of that time frame. And we looked at, their visual focus of attention, and we noticed this was very high towards the robotic meal. So they were engaged in the activity with the robot, and they spent, the majority of time eating the meal items, eating the meal with the meal items. However, at the same time, they talked to the robot a lot. They said a lot of things to the robot, are you going to eat too, for example? Brian, the food smells amazing. And so there was the social interaction aspect of it, because we were trying to promote that idea that meal eating is a social activity. So this was really nice for us to see how they were communicating with the robot. We then looked at compliance. The average compliance was 87, which is pretty high as well. The only person who had lower than an 80% was participant 2, and this was because for one of the meals it was eggs, and she didn't like to eat eggs. So when the robot would prompt her to eat the main dish, which contained the eggs, she would eat the side dish. And so this was interesting for us as well, to see how we can have the robot promote to eat the different types of meals, and if the person doesn't like it, how do you go around trying to encourage them to eat it, especially if it's the most nutritious part of their meal. And the nice thing about this is that the robot measures how much they're eating over time. So if there's changes, this can be told to the care staff. If they're having difficulties eating, this could also be shared with the care staff. For meal eating, we went to meal preparation. So what about the step before, especially for older adults living at home? And since we want to promote independence, could a robot help them with preparing the meal? So this would be, for example, the robot determining that it's mealtime, going to find the user, taking them into the kitchen, and going through the steps of meal preparation. And we did this through our CASPER robot that's shown here. And really what we wanted to do is make CASPER small footprint so that it can fit nicely into condos, as well as friendly, so it has facial expressions similar to Brian. But we did this using 3D printing to keep the cost down. So this is CASPER. It displays its facial expressions using LEDs. As you can see, the mouth is moving when it talks. So, and the nice thing about CASPER is that CASPER can move in the environment. So our first task of finding someone in the environment, CASPER can go and look for Derek and find Derek in the living room, and approach Derek and ask Derek to follow the robot to the kitchen to make a meal. Once they go into the kitchen, we've developed this app for the robot, so the person can select a recipe that they would like to make, and the robot can then help them through the different steps for the meal preparation. So in this case, Derek and CASPER are making a tuna fish sandwich. So CASPER would tell Derek that there's 3 different items that you need. The first item, let's find the bread. If Derek can't find the bread, CASPER can also show where the bread is. And you can just ask CASPER by pressing the large question mark on the app or the tablet. And so CASPER here is pointing out where the food items are. And lucky for Derek, all the food items happen to be in one cabinet. And so he can start now making his meal. There could be also videos shown of the different steps. So if you can't remember exactly how to do that, for example, opening the can, CASPER can show you the video of how to open a can of tuna fish. And so this can go on through the steps until the meal is prepared. And then CASPER can, just like as it escorted the person to the kitchen, escort the person to the dining room to eat the meal. And here they go. What we also did with CASPER is we looked at other types of preparation. So for example, that was a sandwich for mealtime. We looked at things, for example, as making a cup of tea. Using the same concept as we had, this time we integrated this with the coach system that's developed with Alex Milahides and his group to have the robot prompt older adults in a long-term care facility with making just a cup of tea. And so that's what this video shows, CASPER helping seniors in the long-term care facility make a cup of tea. So there's CASPER and one of our participants. And so what it does is it uses its tablet display, similar to how it did for the meal eating app. And it prompts them through the different steps. So for example, step 1 is to turn on the faucet. And that way you can fill up the kettle. So you can see that the robot points to where the faucet is as well, and ask the participant to pick up the kettle and fill it up as well. And then once the kettle is full, the robot asks the participant to put the kettle back and press the button to boil the water. And so this is step by step as well. The robot will now tell, once the water is boiled, to pour the water into the cup. And so similar to how we did with Brian, we wanted to see how people interact, what features that they thought were important for CASPER. And a lot of the feedback that we got was that the robot's voice was very clear to understand, the facial expressions and the pointing gestures were very helpful in going through the different steps of the activity. So this whole idea of having a social robot that communicates naturally became important and was one of the requirements that participants as well as care staff wanted from a robotic system. We then wanted to focus on the games that I was mentioning before, the cognitive interventions. So we had our TANGY robot focus on this, and what we wanted to do was look at two things, bingo, which was our group activity, but also this idea of social networking and connecting to family members or friends, especially individuals living in long-term care or retirement homes where family and friends may be far, so they can't always come to visit, to minimize social isolation. And so we made it really simple. We just developed a system where family members could go online, book a time that they wanted the robot to provide this telepresence or networking, to have a video chat. And when that time came, the robot TANGY would go and find the resident and ask them to connect. And all they had to do was just press either a green button to connect with the family member or a red button that it wasn't a good time to do so. And then they could just easily talk to them. And this is great because they didn't have to have their own tablet, especially there was a lot of residents that weren't used to using technology, so they didn't know how to turn on the tablet or turn on the software. So they would forget to charge the tablet, and this was now all minimized by just doing everything from the robot, or the robot would do everything. So this is kind of a video just showing briefly the idea that TANGY moves in its environment, finds the user at a scheduled time, and then prompts them to start the interaction. And so once the interaction is established, TANGY will tell the resident, okay, your son wants to talk to you, please press the green button, and then the sun comes up, and so they can interact. So in addition to this, we also designed the robot to do bingo and facilitate this, and this is all done autonomously. The robot by itself facilitates the entire bingo activity. We really chose bingo because it has great advantages. It is stimulating in the sense that, you know, you have to remember what numbers have been called out. So there's recall, recognition of the numbers that have been called out, and then of course the motor skills of picking up the bingo markers and marking the cards themselves. And because it's an activity played with multiple people, we wanted to promote social interactions between the players themselves and with the robot. And so what we did before we implemented these two activities was we ran a focus group just to see first what were the residents and caregivers, as well as family members, what were their response to these two activities? Were they important activities that we should focus on that a robot could do? And as well as how did they feel about the appearance of the robot, overall acceptance of robots, and any other activities that they wanted the robot to do. So the responses for the bingo and telepresence activities were that they were both positively received. They thought that these were two activities that the robot could help with. They're also repetitive, so that's great in terms of that. Residents didn't really care what the robot looked like. It was a robot, so a lot of them said it should look like a robot, and I'm good with this design. And in terms of acceptance of robots, because they really didn't have any prior interaction with robots, a lot of them didn't have comments initially. What they wanted to do was interact with the robot first and then see how they feel about the robot. And we thought this was very important going forward, that the easiest way to get people to interact and get their opinions on the robot is to just do some user studies with the robot physically being there. They also mentioned that it would be great if the robot could just be a companion, talking about anything, sometimes just sitting beside the person to minimize isolation, as well as providing reminders and prompting, which was one of our major activities to begin with. So we also wanted to personalize the bingo game. So we saw that at different long-term care facilities, the game is played a little bit different, and that may be based on, how the staff wants to organize the activity or how, based on the capabilities of the residents. So we designed the robot in a manner that it can actually learn how to play the bingo game. So care staff can teach the robot, so you don't have to know how to program. It's all done visually by you showing the robot how to do different tasks. And I'll just show you a very quick portion of this video. So here, the robot is learning how to wave from a caregiver. And so you can see the caregiver's arm goes up, the robot's arm goes up as well. And so that the robot can store that gesture and then combine it with what the person would like to say, for example. And then caregivers could just write out what they wanted to say. And then they could test it by just pressing playback, and the robot would say it, and they would decide whether they like it or not. They could teach the robot to call out bingo numbers, could play background music for the robot. So here's the robot saying a number and then pointing to its tablet to display that number. And so this could be done any way that they wanted. This is the view they also had on the computer, so they could see, for example, what the bingo cards look like, so they could teach the robot how to help a person. For example, the robot would now recognize that someone is asking for help and come over and check the card to see what type of help they need. Once this was done, we then ran another user study, this time with TANGY, facilitating bingo game. And we had 4 users interacting with TANGY at the same time. I am so excited to play bingo with you today. So that's TANGY displaying the wave and the introduction to the game. Everybody got their own bingo card, and there's a button on the table, so everybody has their own button as well, so they can press that to call the robot over to check their card if they need help with anything. So the robot would call out bingo numbers as well as display it on its chess tablet. So this is its pointing. It would also tell jokes to promote social interactions. And then if you needed help, you would just call the robot over by pressing your button, which would show the robot this display of triangle underneath, and it would recognize that and say, I'm going to come over and help somebody. So in this case, the robot comes over to the gentleman to check the card. And we did this a lot slower due to the environment that we're interacting in, so the robot can recognize when people are coming near it, as well as when it goes near to the table. And they're having a discussion of who pressed their button first, and the robot just does this in a queue format, so whoever presses it first, it'll go to them first and then the next person. And so that's what it's doing here. So then if you have a winning bingo card, the robot will also celebrate with you. So in this case, it does a little bit of a dance and plays some music.
Congratulations, you have won bingo. Oh, big work, guys.
And the participants enjoyed that, and they were laughing, and some of them would dance with the robot. And so the idea was, you know, the robot could play about 3 to 4 bingo games within an hour time frame. And we had different participants. There were 7 participants that came to play in these 1-hour time sessions with the robot to see, you know, how they were engaged with this type of activity. And what we noticed was the robot was promoting interactions amongst themselves. So they would talk about the robot, you know, for example, when they press their button, who's the robot going to go to first? When they won, they would, you know, tell each other to look at the robot, it's dancing. And so that was nice to see, as well as they were engaged in the activity itself and complied with the robot's request, for example, marking their bingo cards. We then ran trivia, which we think is a more socially engaging activity amongst the residents themselves, because they're playing in teams. So we had teams of 2 players, or similar to the bingo activity, the robot would, you know, ask questions. In this case, there was multiple choice answers, so we gave the participants a keyboard with A, B, C as their response, so they could press which response they wanted. And we observed the same thing, engagement as well as compliance. And so the numbers are here for both trivia and bingo. And so you can see the average total engagement is high. It's very high actually for trivia, and total compliance comparably high as well, with it being slightly higher for bingo. What we really wanted to see was, you know, what were their overall impressions? So we had similar questionnaires as we had administered for Brian, and we noticed that they were positive with respect to their enjoyment of the trivia and bingo activities and their interest in playing the game with TANGY. What we also wanted to see was, does trivia promote more social interactions between the residents, because now they're playing in teams, and does the robot help facilitate that? And we saw that, you know, they would take turns pressing the button. They would ask each other, you know, do you want to answer the robot, or, you know, it's your turn, why don't you press it, because the robot's looking at you, for example. And so we noticed that there were, in general, more utterances or discussions amongst themselves with the robot there. So this gave us a nice overview of how these robots can be used, since this is very initial pilot studies. Studies like this haven't been done yet around the world. So we were trying to really see, you know, would people accept using these robots? How would they interact with these robots? And would they want to keep interacting with these robots? With that, you know, we've extended our activities of daily living that we're looking at. So I mentioned dressing, for example, and we're using different robot platforms on purpose because we want to see if there's any differences between the types of robots we use. They all have human-like gestures. They can display facial expressions, whether it's through LEDs or the face moving physically. But we wanted to see, does that make a difference? And as we're using a lot of different platforms, we noticed that people still react the same as long as the robot does naturally interact with them. So that minimizes their learning of the technology itself, because it's interacting just the same as a person would with them. And so that's where we're right now doing our work on the clothing recommendation, where I mentioned that the robot could provide clothes for the occasion based on, you know, what the weather is like, what the activity itself is like, as well as preferences. So if a person likes to wear a certain outfit, a certain pair of pants or shirt, the robot would learn this over time. So what we really are doing currently is designing these personalization models for the robot, so that through continuous interaction with a person, the robot can personalize its behaviors and its suggestions or outputs to the person. And so that's where this one is a great activity for that, because you can learn what the person likes to wear. So this is our Leia robot. So she's a little desktop robot, and she displays facial expressions just by changing the colors around her eyes. And we developed an app again for this robot that can go through with the user so that the robot could help choose what you should wear for that activity. So there's a touch screen right beside the robot. The robot prompts the user to it, can recommend different types of clothing based on what the activity you want to do. So you can see kind of the expressions of the robot and the motions of the robot. So here on the screen, the robot is making a suggestion of what to wear: jeans, a sweatshirt, and specific shoes. You can let the robot know if you like it or not. If you don't like it, then it'll suggest something else. If you like it, then you go on to the next thing. Maybe, for example, if it's wintertime, the robot will suggest outerwear after to make sure that if you're going outside, that you have the proper jacket, boots, scarf, and hat. So in conclusion, what we've really been working on is designing these new types of robots, which are assistive robotics, but they interact socially with people. And we wanted to focus on how these robots could benefit the overall health as well as quality of life of older adults and their caregivers. Could they help with this idea of promoting independence and aging in place, having these robots in personal homes to long-term care, retirement homes, and we've had some deployments in hospitals as well. And the objective is to target, where assistance is needed, so we could have these robots do these tasks and help people with these tasks. And as I mentioned, the great thing about these robots is that they can be repetitive, and they can actually repeat the same thing with a smile on their face if that's what's needed. So this is a huge area now, I mean, with respect to the potential of whether it's economic, social, as well as the health benefits that these robots could have. And since we've been working on it now, we're at the stage where we're deploying a lot into long-term care and retirement homes to see what the impacts of these robots can be for our society. And especially, we're looking at also rural places or remote areas where people may not have access to healthcare. They may have to drive very far to get there. And so can we use these robotic technologies to connect people to their caregivers, as well as have at least some technology at home to assist them? So this is my lab, the Autonomous Systems and Biomechatronics Lab at the University of Toronto. And if it wasn't for all these students, we wouldn't be able to develop these robots. And so they've been working hard throughout the years to develop this technology. Some of our robots are here again. And we've had significant funding from, of course, AgeWell and from the government of Ontario, as well as federal government, both on the health and the applied sciences, as well as industrial collaborators. We have several industrial collaborators now who are interested in commercializing these products because of, excuse me, their potential, and specifically their potential in the near future to help us with our older population. And Doreen, I'll pass it to you.
Perfect, thank you. So wonderful presentation, Goldie, and I'm just going to encourage everyone that has joined us on the webinar to please ask any questions. You can do so through the Q&A function or the chat box, and we will ask Goldie those questions. It's a really engaging presentation with lots of videos. Really enjoyed it. Just as people are thinking of their questions, a reminder that our next webinar is on May 15th at 2 p.m. It's on consent and capacity. It's part 1 of 2, and it'll be with Krista James, who is the National Director of the Canadian Centre for Elder Law, which is one of our core facilities. And there we're getting into just some of the legal and ethical concepts that are related to older adults and technology. So I encourage you to register for that webinar. We'll post a link on our Twitter and via our newsletters that I hope you're all signed up on. Perhaps I will start with the question, Goldie. With all of this stuff, I mean, obviously it's in development, and with study participants, you're getting kind of ethics approval and review. But I'm just wondering in general how the logistics of this being implemented from kind of a policy ethics perspective, you know, in a home care setting or in an individual, you know, like obviously if you purchase a robot and then you're kind of buying into that and giving your consent, but perhaps more in a home care environment like the one that you did your study in. How does that look?
So yeah, that's a great question. Thanks. So I think our main objective right now is, so for like long-term care, we'd be looking at, you know, these robots kind of being implemented with, you know, as part of the care cycle. So they wouldn't be necessarily, you know, one robot per resident, but like as we were showing with the bingo and trivia and so on, they can help multiple people at the same time. So as you were mentioning, policy is an important aspect of this. So there's really no policies about how to use robots in these type of environments. So I've been spending a lot of time going back and forth to Ottawa to discuss, you know, now we need to look at, you know, how do we integrate this technology, especially for the users that we're looking at, to have these robots assist them with these different tasks. How do you do that? How do you, you know, ensure that there's safety, as well as, you know, crucial aspects of what we're looking at for the robot. So if it's just a robot that you're gonna, you know, buy and let's say put in your home for more just simple interactions and so on, as you mentioned, that's taken care of once the robot's commercialized. But if we're looking at the health benefits, then we're looking at working closely with Health Canada to ensure that, you know, we're meeting those benefits, what they are, long-term studies, so moving this all from pilot studies to more long-term user studies. Most of our studies, I think the longest one has been 2 months, so we would need to integrate these robots, let's say for 6 months to a year, and look at what the impact and benefits are there as well, and use that to help move to the next stage of getting approvals from whether it's Health Canada or the FDA to use these robots as healthcare robots.
Great, thank you. I have a question from the room here. Just wondering about the cultural adaptability of the socially assistive robots. We're thinking, even if it's, you know, anything from language, even let's say, obviously different languages is kind of another level, but even just phrases, right? Someone may have a different way of saying things culturally, even in English, and how, you know, how do we build that into these systems?
So that's a great question, and that's where the personalization aspect that I was mentioning before helps with that. So the robot learns. So if the person is, you know, likes certain things said a certain way or responds a certain way, the robot learns that. And so that it can, you know, conform its language as well, its wording, how it says things to the person. And so that's this whole idea of kind of having the robot be able to learn. So we're not aiming to just, you know, kind of develop this technology and that's it, but we want to be able to have the robots personalize to different users. So that would help with that. And the language is a great question, because one of the long-term care facilities we were working with, I think it was something like 30% of the residents didn't speak English as their first language, and some of them, you know, only knew a few words in English. So we had the care staff ask us, you know, can the robot translate for them? That would be great, so they would know what the residents specifically want. And so that's the different aspect of it, that you can have these robots do that for you as well, because they can speak multiple different languages. And we can incorporate these. So there are already robots that can speak Japanese, English, French, and so we can add to that.
That's great. That's really interesting.
So that would help with that aspect, right? Especially.
Sure. Yeah. It's yes. I know Google Translate is limited, and I'm sure with AI it would be a lot better.
Yeah, and it would target more, you know, what the interactions would be, right, rather than these more general software systems, right?
Right, yeah, exactly. We've got a question from our online audience from Elizabeth Kelton, wondering, with respect to people living with dementia, what have you found to be the biggest challenge in terms of design?
So I think for us, it's the biggest challenge is, I mean, every individual is different, right? So not only depending on the level of cognitive impairment they have, but how they respond, right? And so I think our biggest challenge is the information that we're taking in from the person, because the robot decides its behaviors, not only just based on the activity, but how the person is behaving. So we're trying to look at things, especially if they can't verbalize. Can we get information if they're struggling to do something, you know, from maybe just the sounds, vocal intonation, maybe their body language, and if they don't actually display facial expression. So can we use different modes to help us? And I think that that's been the most interesting aspect of it, but yet the most challenging is trying to get that information from a person who can't say, you know, this is what's wrong, this is what I need help with. And so I think it kind of creates these opportunities for us to look at all these different modes just to getting that information and how a robot can do that, right? And because the idea is that the robots at this stage are non-contact, so they don't actually touch people. So everything is done through onboard sensors from the robot.
That's great, thank you. So I'm not seeing any further questions. If anyone has questions, again, you can always reach out to us and we can connect you with Goldie. We will have this webinar, it is being recorded, so it will go up on our website after the fact. And I want to thank everyone for joining us today. And Goldie, if you could just stay on the line, that would be great.
Sure.
Have a quick question about making sure we upload the video correctly.
Sure, yeah, and yeah. No, thanks so much for having me, and thank you for the questions. This is great.
Thanks, everyone.